Hello everyone. First of all, I want to ask if it's okay if we do this talk in English. And if there's something left unclear, you can also come to me after the talk, of course. So let me introduce myself. I'm Nele Bianca. I'm a painter and makeup artist, and I work with colors. You probably also noticed them when you went into my installation room here in the bubble. And today I want to share some of my research on color history that I've been doing over the past months. The fascination for this topic developed out of my work as painter, and it also was brought along by some personal life changes, to put it this way. And I began to look at the world in a much more attentive manner, and I developed a sort of research model for arranging colors. I was trying to decode their appearances and to understand the visual language of our surroundings. So what do I mean by this? We encounter colors every day, in daily life, in nature, in metaphors, even in our language when sleeping. They are sometimes used with a symbolic function or in intention. Even more often, colors are being overlooked. I want to show that the brushstrokes which make up today's world are neither completely random nor logical in themselves. They are explainable, and here lies my intention. In this talk, I'm also going to give a short insight into this research model that I've developed. But by researching for this model, I come across a fascinating phenomenon which will be the main topic of my talk tonight, and that is chromophobia, the fear of color. I want to start with a confrontative example, one that caused anger and outrage in the art world. In 1967, American painter Barnett Newman applied red color on a huge canvas. It measured 2 meters 24 in height and 5 meters 44 in width. On the right side of the canvas, he left a thin blue stripe, you cannot really see it here, and on the left side, an even thinner yellow stripe. When the Theology Museum in Amsterdam exhibited the painting, visitors began writing angry letters. They wanted the museum to know that they did not think this was a work of art, because everybody could have made it. The artists continued painting, unimpressed by the public's irritation. There are in total 4 versions of Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow and Blue. All are similarly big in dimension. Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow and Blue 3 here was part of an exhibition. It was the main work which wanted to deal with the question of what is a painting. This was also exhibited in Amsterdam. One day, a visitor of this exhibition brought a knife to the museum, hidden under his coat. He passed the security guards and entered the building successfully. Gerard van Balderen, 31 years old at this time, slit the canvas multiple times before he was arrested and later sentenced to 5 months in prison. Again, people started writing letters, this time addressed to the prison. They were thanking Van Balderen for, quote, doing what others have been wanting to do. One person even wanted to declare him director of modern art museums. So, where does all this anger come from? How can a big red canvas evoke such an emotional reaction? I mean, it's just colors, right? And who's afraid of red?
Wow.
Alright. I feel very offended.
Then, red is also associated with icons. For example, in a Christian context. Here you can see a work by Jan van Eyck, dating to the 15th century. The figure of Madonna is often depicted wearing red. Marilyn Monroe also wore red. Red dresses, lipsticks, a modern icon, walking on red carpets and being photographed on red carpets. But humans also see red in much more direct ways. In nature, imagine blood, imagine fire. Also, the walls of the Altamira caves, which are 14,000 years old, paintings there, show wild animals in red shades. Then, red is also a favorite in advertising. It is used for corporate identity designs, and it can also signify affiliations to political parties. So, after all of these impressions, I would like to introduce my research model, which was the beginning point for my research. Now, imagine yourselves standing in the middle of the color wheel. The idea of the color wheel, constructed as it is the foundation, the basis which I used here. Around this point of intersection, I determine 3 simplified layers, or spheres, in which each color exists. This is the physical, the psychological, and the interpretative realm. For example, if you look at the world through the lens of physics, you find yellow. You find it in psychology and in arts. Same goes for orange, for purple. I think the general idea is pretty clear. So, in regards of our example of red, I would first ask the question, what is red physically? Which wavelengths of red does the human eye perceive as red? This first layer tries to look at the direct response of a body to its environment and to the perception of color through our senses. Now in the second layer, we could think about the psychological effects and uses of red. There we could look at differences, historical or social contexts. And in the third layer, the interpretative uses of red, which is very broad for now, you can look at art. I've also used this model in parts on my paintings here in the bubble. If you want, I could go more into detail during our flashlight tour later. But I think the general idea is pretty easy behind it. But I want to make clear that this model is not made to discover something new, because art history is history. But I want to change our direction of view. Previous models and conceptions of art history are based on epochs, structures, and objects. Our definition of epochs like Baroque or Renaissance relies on the idea of dialectical, opposing movements, which are frameable by annual figures. That is useful. It makes sense for a chronological understanding of art. Nevertheless, I believe the picture is incomplete. The color is missing. I believe the fear of color is deeply engraved in us, or to put it more generalized, into Western society. And it is present everywhere, not always as direct as the response to the question, who's afraid of red, yellow, and blue? The painting, by the way, was shipped to New York under great financial expenses. Their conservator worked on it for 4 years, but he did not manage to get the color right. When the painting, restored, returned to Amsterdam, it has lost the red shiny quality that people has been describing. It looked matte and lifeless. But everyone could have just put some color on a big canvas, right? However, I want to go back to our fear, because before we can start to look at even more specific examples, I want to tell you more about chromophobia. A world without color, without nuances of tone, exists between lines and borders and in black and white opposites. It is comprehensible and explainable. One can find orientation and identity easily. There is male versus female, rationality versus feeling, west versus east, color versus line. Not much space is left in between. Now I want to point out that in all of this the focus should less be on the contrast of black and white versus color, but on the associations to the former and latter. Nobody can deny that color is an integral part of our world. By going back in history though, we can see attempts of controlling color over and over. Plinius the Younger, who was a senator and lawyer in Rome, we can find an example for this black and white worldview already in the 1st century CE. Die rationalen Traditionen der abendländischen Kultur seien von einer heimtückischen, exotischen Sinnlichkeit bedroht. The rational traditions of Western culture are being threatened by a malicious, exotic sensuality. Sounds kind of familiar? Also, in Aristotle's work, we can find the idea of a line being a vessel for thought. He describes a hierarchy of 4 elements within art. The idea or invention being the highest form, then followed by drawing. Then comes chiaroscuro, which is painting in stark contrast of dark and light. And on the lowest rank, we find painting in color. This describes a descent from order and rationality to sensuality and chaos. The contrasting ideal to color is one of perceived clarity, transparency, and purity. We can also find Plato stating, truth is embodied in a shape deprived of its color. The idea lived on, adapted by movements and artists, who looked for a historical justification for their artworks. In art, color assumes an insecure position. While it is needed for the creation of a painting, it is also associated with something chaotic, unspeakable, and irrational. Color is thought to be perceivable only through the senses, not the mind. Color assumes the role of the body, something necessary, but constantly in the way to perfection. Like in antique rhetoric, the body is an instrument for the orator, color is an instrument for the painter. But it holds a dangerous capacity in its central presence. It has the potential to seduce or repulse the audience. It exists in a frustrating materiality and coincidences. Perfection, imagined in a classic idea of beauty, means a control body, a single functioning entity. This ideal body has transcended color into achromatic white. It does not age, does not smell, does not eat or shit. It is freed of everything embarrassing, disgusting, free of fluids. It is clothed with a perfectly even surface, and no fat or flesh dares to break the outlines of its shape. It is freed of change and alteration. This image of a marble white antiquity is a persevering myth. The Liebig Museum in Frankfurt established a collection of Greek, Roman, and Egyptian sculptures. It is one of the leading institutions in research regarding color history, specifically the polychromy of antiquity. The Liebig Museum opened a world touring exhibition in 2003 called Gods in Color, which is set out to answer the following question. Museum exhibitions of ancient Greek and Roman sculpture are striking for the dominance of pure white marble. But looks can be deceiving. These figures of gods and heroes were once richly clothed in vivid colors. We've known this for centuries. So why does this image of whiteness still persist? Let's go back to the actual roots of this powerful cultural image. Sculptures were an important part in the architecture of ancient Greek temples. They could be found several meters above the ground on the pediments and the walls of the buildings. To make the statues visible from a distance, vibrant colors were used, and it made the individual statues appear almost alive. Here you can see a computer-generated view produced by the Iowa State University, which shows the Parthenon as it could have looked. And also here you can see a reconstruction of the Alexander sarcophagus, which is as a reconstruction also exhibited in Frankfurt. After the Roman conquest of Greece in 146 before Common Era, many works of art were taken to Italy, where they were copied in large numbers. Already then, the pigments did not always stand the test of time and the elements. Paint was made from natural materials with differing durability. So mineral-based hues like red or blue, which are made of stones like azurite or malachite, for example, can last for centuries. Yellow, which is derived from earth, vanishes quickly. In 14th century Italy, we can see a renewed debate on antiquity, forming a movement which would later be called Renaissance, from the French word for rebirth. Scholars were consciously turning their backs on medieval notions of the universe. Finds of ancient sculpture and writing were by then mostly Roman copies of Greek originals, and they were taken as a cue for a new system of values and image of man. Now, to get an impression of what Renaissance scholars were trying to differentiate themselves from, let's take a look at the medieval body and this grotesque realism. The medieval body is plagued by its existence in the world. It is soaked in sin, dirt, and colors. Only once the sinful body is left behind, we will see white and also gold. It signifies divine influence in light. This artistic practice is based on the so-called light metaphysics. In parts, it was initiated by the study of optics among monks in the 13th century. Also, contributions came from Dominicans like Thomas Aquinas, who studied Aristotle's natural sciences. Arabic scholar Al-Hasan, who lived in the 1st century CE, also had a direct influence on the idea because he was the first one to rationally analyze the nature of light and he differentiated not artificial and natural light sources, and also studied the emission and refraction of light rays. The principles of light metaphysics have a strong pedagogic character. So it was based on the natural sciences of Aristotle, for example, but here a strong pedagogic character comes in. And one metaphor is especially important. Light was seen as the first physical form, and the material world as its product. The image of light as the beginning point of life goes back to the first book, to the book of Genesis in the Bible. There it is said that God created heaven and earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, and it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. This first day of creation is painted in white, powerful light. You can see it here, the division of light and darkness. In the following days, colors of the sky, land, plants, sun and moon, creatures, and finally men are added. This also describes a hierarchy, but one of moral goodness. The influence of the divine in man was set analogous to the infusion of light in different materials. Certain colors and materials either repel light or they are saturated by its grace, so they reflect it or they don't. Precious stones, for example, and glass attract light inwards. They receive and transmit it. This kind of thinking actually derives from magic and alchemy. Here, Greek scholar Empedocles introduced the idea that everything in the world is made up of certain basic elements. Now, influencing the attraction between those elements, so repelling unfavorable ones while receiving the favorable ones, is one of the basic principles behind magic thinking. In Empedocles' doctrine of sympathy, the sun is the most favorable planet, and it is attracted by gold and light. These analogies had an influence on the artistic practice. Art becomes a materialization of theology. Artists in the Middle Ages, when wanting to depict the most sacred ideas or persons of Christianity, used glass and gold. It does not repel light, instead it attracts it, and therefore it also attracts divine influence. Colors here take up the role of the body, and on a higher level of man and humanity. Its position is contested by good and evil. Eternal salvation is only possible by attracting, receiving, and transmitting the divine influence of God, in a metaphorical and literal sense. Colors are a vessel for the divine, the instrument to which light gets broken and reflected, the mortal body carrying an immortal soul. In Renaissance times, the idea of art changed, and the view on humanity changed as well. Instead of the monastic ideal of life in poverty and modesty, the idea of enriching life through personal wealth was embraced more. Historian Richard Tarnas describes the shift as an emergence of a new consciousness, expansive, rebellious, energetic, curious, and committed to this life and this world. All in all, here we can find a much more individualistic view on life than with thinkers of the Middle Ages. In 1489, the Apollo of Belvedere was found. Today it is thought to be a Roman recreation from the reign of Hadrian, so around 135 Common Era. We cannot say for sure if the artists copying Greek originals are also adopted polychromy of its statues. By the point of excavation in the 15th century, some traces of pigment might have survived, but due to contact with sunlight and also cleaning, most of it was lost. Also, no scientific method was established then to analyze those pigments. The Apollo of Belvedere was brought to the courtyards of the Vatican in Rome. Artists rushed there to study and copy the sculpture. They focused on the white marble, on its pristine skin, and the timeless form of beauty. Nature, in its individual expression, created by God, becomes the model for the artist. The goal is no longer to emulate nature, but to capture the core of its essence. A debate on which art form is more suitable for this challenge emerged. It would later be called paragony, and the question was painting or sculpture. Defendants of the latter compared the act of sculpting out of stone to the divine act of creation. As they are tangible material objects, statues are closer representations of nature. Painting and the use of color was dismissed as superficial and illusionist, a distraction from the true form. Monochrome statues also served as a distinction from the colorful religious statues found at that time in churches. This image of a marble white antiquity, the foundation of rational Western society, lives on in other revivals of ancient art, like in neoclassicism. By then, more excavations also found statues with distinct traces of pigment. However, this visual evidence was largely ignored. The quest for aesthetic harmony and perfection seemed to have found its perfect expression in the pure formal language of antiquity. Colors have to submit to the dominance of lines and the higher interests of the mind. Another, a bit more recent example describes this sentiment in a drastic warning. Charles Blanc was a color theoretician and Minister of the Arts in the government of 1848 in France. He writes on color. The unification of color and drawing is necessary to the art of painting, as is the unification of men and women to humanity. But drawing must prevail over color, otherwise painting is doomed to its demise. It will fall, like humanity fell, on account of Eve. One can summarize in Chromophobia, so the devaluation and attempts of controlling color, two important manifestations of that fear arise. First, color is perceived as something unfamiliar, something strange, something which does not belong to higher spheres of intellect and rationality. Especially in colonial contexts, this becomes very apparent. The other, that is the female, the primal, the pathological, the childish, the foreign, and the queer. The self, which is creating the contrast here, identifies itself as male, European, to be more clear, Northern European. Also, it identifies as educated, wealthy, heterosexual, and healthy. The second manifestation sees color as something shallow and superficial, a sort of makeup on actual reality. Colors here are something less real, an illusion, a fraud, a distorted seduction. Associations of femininity, queerness, and colors play a role here. The fear of colors is a fear of losing power. If the self loses its prevalent visual power in the world, it loses its position. It will fall from the top of the hierarchy and put itself first. Who knows what today's world would look like based on a more accurate, more colorful, and more inclusive historical understanding. Today, based on historical accounts and more scientific examination methods, we can see one example, or several examples, like in the Museum of Frankfurt, and I want to show you one, which is called the small Herculaneum woman. It was found in 1814 with visible traces of blue, ochre, and earth tones, also red, white, and yellow, and traces of gilding, so the yellow, gold, which you can see here. Reconstruction today is possible, and it shows that in antiquity, polychromy was the norm. Painting and sculpture went hand in hand. The combination of two artistic media made the ideal work of art possible. I think we need to reposition our concepts of the body and the idea of the soul in art and humanity. I would propose a more realistic view on the body. Now, this doesn't mean disregarding it, but a detachment from concepts of purity. One could look at the body as a home one cannot be evicted from, a space of one's own, but I think this would go in a different direction than this talk. Colors are a source of visual power. Chromophobia condenses a variety of phobias related to what has been defined as the other. Here lies the reason for the attempts of devaluating or controlling them. I like the idea of colors as an expression of the soul, which was translated beautifully into a performance by Patricia on her opening night. I'm grateful I've been part of it. On stage, I was painting the colors of the rainbow on her chest, to a monologue of Swedish singer repeating, "The soul. The soul has no gender." The soul has no gender because gender does not matter in acknowledging someone's humanity. The soul has no race, no size. One's humanity, and I also believe one's creativity, is something untouchable. I mean creativity in its most literal sense, not only in art. There's creativity in creating a space. There's creativity in a conversation. So if you create from your soul, show your colors, as they say, you can transform and redefine categorizations like gender, which can be restrictive and can hinder expressions of truth and freedom. Now, I want to show you one last picture of the details of the statue, and I also want to end this talk with a simple, but as we've seen, quite subversive statement. Show off your colors. Thank you.
Whoa!